day we will be working on the stratigraphy of the Ager Basin. And the way we work out the stratigraphy, we need to know what kind of facies we are dealing with. Otherwise we just would map rocks, nothing else, lithologic unit. So we have to try to put facies in our stratigraphy. And this is a typical exposure of tidal sediments which became a classical one in the literature. The sediments, the outcrop, are colloquially referred to as the Bar del Maño outcrop. The Bar del Maño is was located over there, now it's closed. Just to tell you what the improvement of our knowledge has been during over the year. At the beginning, these sediments were mapped as a flesh, so actually nobody had taken care of the facies. Now we know these are tidal sediments, and the model for the tidal sediments you have in here is a model which is primarily derived from the classic work on tidal sedimentation of the Dutch school. I mean people like Van Straten, Boersma, Terwind, and also German Reineck. So there's nothing new in what you are looking at up here. If we consider by diurnal tides, things are relatively easy to understand. A tidal environment can be described in terms of supratidal, which is only occasionally reached by tides. Then you have a boundary between the supratidal and the intertidal, which is here, and coincide with the mean high tides. Then you have an intertidal zone that can be quite wide, several kilometers across, and then you reach a point where you move into the subtidal environment, which is all the time below sea level. The typical tidal facies, or the classical tidal facies, are those developed in the intertidal zone, which is the easiest to understand because you can check day after day what's going on the flat. So beginning from here and moving across the tidal flat, tidal current lose velocity for friction, and at the beginning the currents are strong enough to produce bed forms, which are essentially mega ripples. Then the current velocity decreases and you start having ripples, and then decreases again and the ripple gets starved until you come into an area where only mud accumulates. When the tide goes back, reaccelerate gradually from here down to here, and so you have lower velocity here and higher velocity here. The typical tidal facies develop in the intertidal environment are the classic herringbone cross stratification. So cross lamina which are dipping in opposite direction. The typical facies associated with the ripple migration is what is called the flaser bedding, where you have thin mud drapes forming in the trough of the ripples. Then moving upward, you have alternating thin-bedded sandstone with ripples and mudstone until the ripples become very rare, they disappear, and then you go into the mud flat. So this is basically the tidal flat model. In front here, you have several facies that fit exactly. You have this one, and this one, and occasionally some of this. So we may take a look now of these different type of facies, and then moving down section a little bit and see what happens in the subtidal environment. And the subtidal sediments have been discovered more recently, and they are extremely common and very interesting. We look at those sediments quite often. So we can stop and start looking at the different facies. We take a look at of three examples of facies here, then we will see some more detail in the next exposure. Here you have an example of herringbone cross stratification. You see that the lamina here are dipping to the right and up on top on the left. If you look generally at the exposure, most of the current is going to the right, which means that it's flood dominated, so is the tide coming from the sea. So this is the herringbone. We have another example of very nice facies in here. I don't know where I can put the knife. Here. Look. And here you have flaser. You see that you have mudstone parting interbedded with sand. The sand is entirely rippled. So these mud are deposited in the trough of the ripple when the current slows down during slack water. Here you have a very typical feature, a flaser which has a flat top. And these flaser are referred to as capped off flaser and are interpreted as typical intertidal feature. So herringbone below, flaser in here. If you look carefully, everything is loaded with clay chips. When the current reaccelerates, the mudstones which have been deposited in the previous slack water are eroded and transported away. And this is wavy bedding. Most of the ripple are produced by wave action, and these waves have not to be mistaken for a beach environment. These are capillary waves produced by the wind on the tidal flat. When you have a few centimeters of water, you develop an oscillatory motion, and most of the ripple is there for the shape of the wave ripple. Look at the amount of clay chips you have in here, everywhere. So one of the first characteristics of tidal sediments is the pervasive occurrence of mud drape and clay chips. I would say it's really diagnostic. Stop.